you. Thank you very much. I've always admired the Rotary, and in my career I've never had time to join. The meetings are always on the wrong day. This is a beautiful Prairie School building. I suppose you guys are responsible for that. Now, there's a lot of background noise from the fans and the air conditioning. Who has trouble hearing me? Would you like me to speak loudly or slowly or both? Okay. Eat the mic, as they say. Is this better? Okay. Right now going on are some slides. We were down there for 6 weeks and we only had 10 flights. So that left time to take other photographs and do things. So this is just a slideshow from our time down there. Now I'm going to switch over, if it's all right, to the presentation. We'll start at the beginning, if that's all right. This is a picture of the Perlan glider. Now, how many of you know the difference between a glider and a sailplane? Good. How many of you have pilot training? Okay, good. So we have a pretty naive audience, and that's favorable. A glider is any aircraft that's designed to fly without the use of an engine, using upward rising currents of air that match the glider's normal rate of sink. A sailplane is a glider that's designed to fly long distances. At any rate, this is a picture of the Perlan glider. It's bespoke designed to fly to 90,000 feet. It's a space capsule with wings. Those portholes are for the pilots who need to see out sometimes. They did confess to me that they perhaps have them a little smaller than they really need to be. The glider itself is named Perlan, which is Icelandic for the mother of pearl clouds that you rarely see in the stratosphere. I'm 72 years old, and I've been wanting to see Perlan clouds since I was 12. Finally, on June the 8th, driving home from a concert in St. Paul, I saw these beautiful white clouds glowing above the horizon between 10 and 10:30 at night. So, not having my good camera, I got out my cell phone. And then I had an extended correspondence with our meteorology consultant, who's an expert on stratospheric weather, and said, "Are these really Perlan clouds?" And bless her heart, she did all the research. She downloaded the satellite images and got my exact location and GPS coordinates and did the trigonometry, and eventually came back and said, yes, she and her consultants agree that these are Perlan clouds. About 2 weeks later, these were also seen above Europe. They're quite amazing. They're not purely water. They're mostly nitric acid, and they're crystalline. And of course, they're so high that they're lit brightly long after sunset. In case you don't know, this is a sailplane. This is one of the newest, most modern hotshot sailplanes, which you notice because the wings have several angles in them, and they have the upturned winglets on the tip. And then there's a little tiny jet engine behind the cockpit. You know, for the rich guys, the newest thing is to have a self-launching sailplane that uses a jet, and then a little door opens underneath and it drops back into the fuselage for the duration of the flight. In general, you have to get up, even on days like today, 1,000 or 2,000 feet above the ground in order to be able to catch the thermals that keep you aloft. Anytime there's a puffy cloud day like today, you can, in a glider, a good sailplane, go up to cloud base and just stay there until the clouds go away. And there's another type of soaring called mountain wave soaring, which I'll get into. If you want more detail, I've got 3 articles at the Perlan Pieces tiny URL location. Also, the Perlan product has a web link. I'll put this up again at the end. Now, I've only got until 3:30, right? No, I was told 1:15. Is that okay with you guys? I'll try to keep this interesting. So let's look at some altitude records. First of all, the airplanes, and then second, the recent glider records. The first altitude record was the Wright Flyer in December 1903, achieved an altitude of 10 feet. The highest an airplane has ever gone was a MiG-25 in 1977. They used a ballistic launch and rocket assist, and they managed to get it up to 123,000 feet and then drop back to Earth. In level cruise, the highest documented altitude is the SR-71 Blackbird. Has gotten to, they've known it's gotten to about 84,000 feet. One pilot casually claimed that he had been in level flight at 90,000 feet once. I'm willing to believe that. The U-2 has achieved at least 74,000 feet. That's highly weather dependent. It's basically on the edge of a stall at the top of its range. And then there's two propeller-driven aircraft. One is the Grob Egret, which set a record of 54,000 feet in 1988. It has been to 58,000 feet, and it cruises at 55, but they only documented that one altitude for the International Federation. Its successor, the Grob Strato 2C, has been to 60,000 feet. They've never put that into production because it's basically unflyable. The test pilot who flew both of these in Germany told me that the time he experienced the most fear in his life as a pilot was the second flight of the Grob Strato, because he then knew how very difficult it was to control. The Perlan glider has achieved several records. In 2017, 52,000 feet. They did not go any higher because the hatches they had were beginning to wet potato chip in the cold. And the pilots couldn't afford to lose pressurization. Then last year they achieved 3 records in 8 days, going up like good test pilots about 4,000 feet at a time. They made it to 76,000 feet the last flight, partly because they couldn't get down. They're flying in very good rising air, and when they made the decision it's time to quit, they turned trying to get out of the rising air and failed and kept on going up. Terrible accident. Their aim this year is to get to 90,000 feet. We believe it's possible, partly because of the tow plane. Now, we are little tiny specks at the bottom of this graph. This is one depiction is a cartoon of the Earth's atmospheric structure. People have claimed that the Earth's atmosphere extends to the moon, but I don't know if you can justify calling it atmosphere just because you find a molecule there that may have come from the Earth. In any case, it gets really wispy. The Perlan glider flies up to about 25 kilometers, which is right about there. You see the tops of thunderstorms depicted down here. That's a very important layer called the tropopause. All the weather occurs in about the bottom 40,000 feet or so, the bottom 8 miles of atmosphere. And there's a discontinuity between this tropopause, the troposphere, and the stratosphere called the tropopause that blocks the movement of air upward into the stratosphere by and large. There are some air exchanges that occur between the two, but they're through special mechanisms. This is a listing of past soaring altitude records. The top one in Germany in 1937 by Joachim Kuttner is a fascinating story. They saw these beautiful clouds near the glider port and always wondered what it was like. And one day, when wearing casual clothing, Joachim got into an open cockpit glider with no oxygen and no winter clothing and went up. At 22,000 feet, his nails were turning blue, his brain was getting a little foggy, and he looked up and there were 2 suns, which made him realize that maybe he should just start descending. You see, the body has no oxygen detector. Shortness of breath is never caused by oxygen lack. Shortness of breath is always caused by something else. Too much acid in your blood, too much carbon dioxide in your blood, anxiety, but not lack of oxygen. At any rate, Joachim decided it was time to descend and land. He landed in a farm field. Everybody around him spoke Polish. They allowed him to call back to the glider port to arrange a rescue. They weren't going to be there until about 3 in the morning. They fed him supper. They took him out to a cottage on the farm, showed him where to go to bed. He took his clothes off, went to bed, and then the farmer's daughter came in and went to bed. Then a man showed up at the window over her bed and started talking to her in Polish. Now he's really worried because this is obviously her boyfriend. He doesn't think anybody realizes that he's in bed naked in the room. And so he said he got not one wink of sleep, worried about this. At about 3 in the morning, headlights swept through the yard, and the boyfriend turned and said in perfect German, "Your ride is here." Kim went on to become a meteorologist. He was one of the leading researchers of mountain wave phenomena. The Sierra Wave project listed next involved him. He was one of the leading researchers, though not one of the pilots. But these people were using mountain wave to go as high as they could, and all the subsequent flights down to the Bob Harris flight in 1986 were in tropospheric mountain wave. The following records were in stratospheric wave. You have to get through the tropopause to get that high. In order to do that, you need to be in the polar night jet. Let me go ahead a little bit. A NASA test pilot named Einar Infaldsen, testing the Egret and the Stratos in Germany, walked by a bulletin board and saw this image. This is an image of stratospheric mountain wave over the mountains of Sweden, going up to 76,000 feet. Einar, as an avid soaring pilot and stratospheric test pilot who flew many stratospheric airplanes for NASA and the Air Force, instantly understood that this meant you could fly a glider to 80 or 90,000 feet. He knew how to design one. He was an aeronautical engineer. He understood the weather. And so he formed the idea of designing a glider that could fly as high as possible. His initial thought was 100,000 feet. In order to do that, you need rising air. So first of all, you need to understand that in the polar night, a special jet stream develops in the stratosphere circling around the dark pole. In our winter, it's north of us. In our summer, it's over the South Pole. There are 3 jet streams on Earth. One is the subtropical jet, which is down around the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. Our fronts tend to follow these streams. Another one is the polar jet, which brings us our low systems that sweep through. In the winter, that comes down across the southern US. In the summer, it generally goes up across southern Canada. Right now, it's basically sweeping across the Canada-US border, bringing the secluded weather we've had. This is a picture of a model of the southern night jet over Antarctica and sweeping across. You can see on the bottom right over southern Argentina. And that's the reason we're going to El Calafate, is because the southern polar night jet sweeps across the Andes from time to time in their winter. The Andes mountains disturb air flowing across them. This is a cartoon of mountain wave. What happens is that the air flows across a ridge that's nearly perpendicular to the air, and it drops on the backside. The mountains kick it up a little bit. The important thing is the drop, and then it bounces. There's generally a stable air layer above, depicted by this white line, and how much it bounces and how fast it bounces and where it bounces, it depends partly on the terrain beyond that first ridge. If you look at satellite pictures of Minnesota, you look across Lake Superior when the wind comes across the North Shore, there's no mountain there, is it? The way the air drops. And then you can sometimes see it bouncing all the way across Lake Superior. And when there's rows of mountains, sometimes the following rows of mountains augment the wave and sometimes they decrease the wave. But this also shows the tropopause, which serves to block the bounce. So in order to have a bounce in that night jet, you need to have the night jet disturbed by the mountain wave beneath. They're not linked, but it can be triggered by it. Now, to keep from putting you to sleep, I'll go on further. Here's a satellite view of South America, showing you see the ripples, vertically shaped ripples. This is mountain wave from across the Andes. So the key is in your glider to get in the upgoing portion of that wave. In this cross-section, this is a weather prediction model, and this shows the red is the upgoing air, the blue is the downgoing air. Now you'll notice a couple of things. Down at the lower half of this is the tropospheric mountain wave, and this is the stratospheric wave, and you see they're not tightly linked. So in past years, the challenge was hopefully you'd find a place where they were sort of linked and you could get across the tropopause. That very seldom happened, about once a year, and pilots could have had trouble finding it. In this case, you can see this rising air descends down to only 12 kilometers high. And so that was useful. Now let's talk about how wings work, in case you're interested. If you take a piece of plywood and tilt it a little bit like your hand out of the car window, it pushes the air down and that pushes your hand up, right? And the reason airplane wings are not shaped like cardboard or plywood is because that's inefficient. The reason airplane wings are curved beautifully like this is simply to make the act of pushing the air down more efficient. So when you have a massive airplane flying, they basically have to push a mass of air down equivalent to the mass of the airplane. That's an oversimplification, but that's kind of how it works. Now there's a limit to altitude as well. If you can get an airplane up high enough, as the air gets wispier, the speed of sound decreases, and there develops a transition over the wing called a shock wave. The airflow gets transonic. If you're lucky enough to be flying at a high altitude in a commercial aircraft right next to the wing, and the sun is coming across the body, you can sometimes see a little bright line along the wing, which is the transonic wave of your airliner. I've seen that a couple of times. If the wing is designed for that, fine. If the wing is not designed for that, what happens is that the spot at which the lift is exerted, what's called the center of lift, shifts backwards, and that tips the nose down, which makes the airplane go faster, which moves it further aft, and the airplane will descend out of control. That phenomenon is called Mach tuck, and it generally destroys the aircraft. You don't like to do that up high. Now this shows the wispiness of the air. The black curve simply shows how the pressure decreases as you go higher. Up above about 63,000 feet, water boils at body temperature. And so if you suffer a decompression incident above 63,000 feet, the juices in your body vaporize and turn to bubbles. This is considered undesirable. Actually, this has happened to people. There was a maintenance guy went into an Air Force vacuum chamber to clean it years ago. And being a guy, he was curious, what would happen if I throw this switch? Well, what happens is the door swings shut and locks, and the room goes to full vacuum. It was after hours, but fortunately someone else was nearby and knew how to restore pressure, so he was only in vacuum for 3 or 4 minutes, and he survived. When they've done this with animals, they puff up to about 3 times their body size in a minute or so, and if they're immediately decompressed, they go back to normal size with minimal injury. Now, airplanes fly with air pressure. The less air there is, the less pressure there is. Each aircraft has an airspeed indicator in the panel. That runs on pressure. The actual speed is different than the airspeed. But you need to know the airspeed because the airplane has to go a certain speed in order to fly. It's called the stall speed. Above the stall speed, you fly. Below the stall speed, you don't fly. It's very simple. So generally, pilots learn to fly fast. But when up in the high troposphere and the stratosphere, the true airspeed is very much different from the actual airspeed. In the case of Perlan, at 76,000 feet, the indicated airspeed is 48 knots, 55 miles an hour. And the stall speed is about 38 knots. But at 76,000 feet, which they got to last year, 48 indicated is 250 miles an hour. The sink rate of that glider is about 110 feet per minute at sea level, And it's 6 times that fast at 90,000 feet. So they need rising air that's going up faster than 700 feet a minute in order to stay up. Fortunately, because the wind velocities are very high in the stratosphere, the velocity of the upgoing air is often very high as well, 15, 20 miles an hour. And so that's why it works out. And so El Calafate was chosen for these flights because it's in the lee of the Andes. It's very close to the Andes. The polar night jet goes over the Andes once every couple of weeks or so down there. It's the southernmost usable airport. There's a town there, civilization, and there's a flying club that's willing to let us use their hangar. Everything adds up. This is the glider in real life. It shows a worshiper genuflecting in front of it, and the ground crew getting ready to launch. The control tower of the El Calafate airport is back behind it, and the gas tanks as well. We don't use that gas. This is just a slide showing the landing gear. There's one main gear, and with a lot of radio antennas. Turns out that the glider is made of carbon fiber, which absorbs radio waves. And so all the antennas have to be put in the skirt around the wheel, which is made of fiberglass, so they can communicate. There's something important about airspeed as well. Speed keeps you up, but speed can destroy the aircraft. All the control surfaces are hinged, right? And at a certain point, as the airplane, any aircraft goes faster, the normal turbulence in the air becomes harmonic with the natural resonant frequency of the aircraft. And so it will start to vibrate. Turns out that's related to true airspeed and not to pressure. So a typical general aviation slower aircraft may develop this tendency at a fairly low speed, 130, 140 miles an hour. The Perlan glider is designed to develop that above 0.6 of a Mach, 0.6 of speed of sound. It turns out that you can decrease this tendency to flap by putting weight ahead of the hinge. In this case, they added that with little lead torpedoes attached ahead of the hinges on the ailerons. Now, what happens at high speed is not merely that the control surfaces start to flutter, but the entire aircraft starts to twist and bend. And the flutter of the control surfaces is only in response to that. And so in the tail, they have an extension off the end. Those are made of tungsten in the Perlan glider to decrease that tendency. So far, none has been experienced. For your enjoyment, this is the hatch. The pilots get in through the top window. The blue is a silicone band that actually forms the seal. The black is a foam strip that positions that. In 2016, as I explained, the hatches started potato chipping in the minus 70 degrees Celsius temperatures, and so they had new, more robust hatches made, which would work just fine.
What was the blanket or the cloth?
Protection. These things are polycarbonate. They scratch very, very easily.
Oh, so that just comes off before it flies?
Oh yeah, it's just resting on the top of the glider on the blanket, and all that, the masking tape and stuff are just for handling. They do not allow one inch of that polycarbonate to be exposed until they need it. Sir?
Is it a pneumatic seal?
It's a pneumatic seal. Yeah, the cockpit is pressurized to 18,000 feet, and the pressure outside is almost zero. So there's a lot of force keeping the hatch in place.
What's pressurizing it?
Pardon?
What mechanism pressurizing it?
Scuba tank. They have a giant scuba tank in the tail of the glider. They control the leaks. The leaks, I think, are about 7 liters per minute at maximum, and they've never used more than half the air that I know of. They have to bleed room air into the cockpit because they don't want a high concentration of oxygen in the cockpit. I'll get to some more of that in a minute. This is one of the answers. You see, they get in the glider on the ground, garbed for minus 60 Celsius temperatures. So they get hot and sweaty. Sweat is moist. When they get up and the windows get cold, the moisture condenses on the windows as frost, and then they can't see out, which is inconvenient. Never mind the lack of entertainment. So the chief engineer, Morgan Sandercock, developed this highly expensive ventilation system. He cut the bottom off a Coke bottle, and while they're climbing up to about 10, 12,000 feet until they're ready to pressurize, he just keeps that Coke bottle in the rear hatch, and it ventilates the cockpit very nicely, gets rid of all the humidity, and then he slips the Coke bottle out and puts the hatch in place, and then they pressurize the cockpit. The cockpit is made of carbon fiber with a foam sandwich. The prototype was tested to 23.5 psi, at which point it failed. They only need 8.5 psi pressure differential to get to 90,000 feet. So they've got basically a threefold safety margin on pressurization. This is a picture of the front office with the pilot in front and with his giant picture windows. Above him you see a little bit of tinfoil, which is a necessary sunscreen. It gets very, very hot and very bright without that.
Sitting or lying?
Yes, he's in the chaise lounge position. All gliders are like that. It does not involve exercise. The canisters are the rebreathing system. To manage the humidity and the carbon dioxide, the pilot's air is rebreathed, the water is scrubbed out, the carbon dioxide is scrubbed out, oxygen is leaked in. This is a picture from the front of the chief pilot. That's Jim Payne in flight. Well, this is the back office with nobody in it. Excuse me, this is the front office again. This is the this is the gear, spoiler lever. This is the control stick. And then the rest is our instrument. And I won't bore you by telling you what all the instruments do. This is the back office. Because the visibility is so limited, they have 2 cameras on the tip of the tail. And those are wired into this iPad, which shows them the camera view. So even if the windows are completely iced up, they can see what's happening out front with the iPad. Frankly, they're not eager to land with that. The view is not quite so precise as they would like, but they could if they needed to. And they can keep it right set up that way. They also have an artificial horizon. And then this one is monitoring all the systems. They have, in this glider, Morgan has put 16 Arduino microprocessors, which are constantly monitoring everything, the angles of the control surfaces and whether there's flutter and the temperature of every single battery in there, the oxygen concentrations and so on. This is the communications control, Capcom. Morgan Sandercock is the guy in the green jacket. He's an Australian engineer. This project would not exist if it were not for Morgan. He's very bright and very good. Next to him is Ed Warnock, who happens to be the CEO, but also runs Capcom during the season. This is the secret to stratospheric flying. This is the egret. After the season of 2017, it dawned on these guys that they weren't getting into the stratosphere. And ironically, the guy, Einar Enevoldsen, who had envisioned this project in the first place, also was the test pilot for this airplane in Germany, and nobody put 2 and 2 together until the end of the 2017 season, and they looked at each other and said, we need a tow plane that goes into the stratosphere. Wait, the egret, and this does. With this tow plane, they were able to tow to 42 to 45,000 feet. Because they could tow the glider to 45,000 feet in about 45 minutes, they were able to get dropped off in the stratospheric mountain wave and just climb to where they needed to go. Without this, the task would be unreliable, as we've shown in past years. Arnie Vassenden owns 2 of these. I should say his wife owns 2 of these. He's the pilot. It has long wings, 104 feet, big tail. This was designed as a spy plane to hold a ton of electronic gear. This is just for fun. We put the glider and the tow plane together. The glider's wingspan is less than 100 feet, but not by much. This is the tow rope apparatus. Mike Malice designed and had this built. It's a trumpet. There's a reel inside of the fuselage. plays out almost 300 feet of spectra. 3 millimeter spectra has a breaking strength of about 3,500 pounds. This is Mike doing maintenance. That's kind of a fun image. And this is the business end of that trumpet. The glider is attached by this ring. And then when this is the glider on tow, I'm glad that my camera was able to resolve the tow rope. You see the tow plane is pitched up. He's flying very slowly for him at about 70 knots. His stall speed is about 60, so he's pitched up high. And the glider is well above stall speed at 70 knots, so he got pitched nose down. This is the El Calafate. This is the airport. It's right on Lago Argentino, the biggest lake in Argentina, with some low mountains in the background. This is a picture of the tow rope after release. That flops around marvelously. It even tied an overhand knot in itself one day. Mike got it out. Down below is part of Lago Argentino, and they're well above the clouds at this point. There's probably 43,000 feet here. So there's some risks to pilots. I'll briefly go through those. We talked a little bit about visibility, and they keep making changes to make visibility better. I think this year they're going to have some heated air blowing across the windows as a defroster. There's the possibility of breaking mountain wave. You know that anywhere there's wave, the top can outrun the bottom, and then it breaks. I was told, I think incorrectly, that breaking mountain wave in the stratosphere can have vertical velocities of 100,000 feet per minute. I think that's wrong. I think that's high. But the physics of that and the aerodynamics were understood, and the Perlan glider is designed for plus or minus 3 Gs, and they feel that's adequate to handle breaking mountain wave if they should encounter it. Cold is a risk. It gets really cold, and so the pilots wear electric trousers, electric insoles, electric vests, and they plug into ship's power. That's quite effective, except when a couple of years ago, one of the pilots lost the battery to his electric sock and nearly froze his foot. And then last year, once the chief pilot decided he didn't need to turn on his electric stuff, and then he started shivering and turned it on. Then the air is a risk. The low air pressure is obviously a risk. The pilots breathe 100% oxygen, not because they need oxygen supplementation, but because if you breathe 100% oxygen before the decompression incident, the risk of decompression sickness goes way down. The Air Force did studies years ago showing that if at 25,000 feet, if you have a decompression incident, a fit person only has a risk of about 20% of getting decompression symptoms. At 45,000 feet, everybody gets it, unless they've been breathing 100% oxygen for an hour and a half or more, in which case it's only 10%. Then that is why all fighter pilots breathe 100% oxygen from the ground up, and why they do it here. So if there's a decompression incident, the pilots will not be impaired by decompression sickness. You don't need to read this. This is a cartoon showing how a breaking wave might happen above a mountain. This is a picture of breaking wave. These are called Kelvin-Helmholtz waves. They're very beautiful, but you would not want to fly your airplane through these. That's the sort of thing that breaks wings off. Temperature. We are all little furnaces, but we only produce 70 watts. That's enough to heat a room or to heat the bed up, but not enough to survive in really cold temperatures. Here's the pilots all dolled up for flight. These are bespoke flight suits with openings for everything you need. Miguel Otamendi is not holding a USB cable in his left hand. It is for a different purpose, plugs into something else. We humans are very good at protecting our skin temperature, and that's what preserves us from hypothermia. We get uncomfortable long before we get too cold in general. And we just for your interest, we have 4 different temperature receptors, which creates the precision our skin has in detecting temperature. It turns out, too, that the heat pain receptors are uncomfortable, and Water that's hot enough to scald you slightly is exactly the temperature that activates the heat receptors, the heat pain receptors most strongly. And temperatures that are more likely to cause frostbite or freezing, activate the cold pain receptors most strongly. It turns out that the system seems to be designed for what it needs to be. Hypoxia is a risk to everyone who flies or goes high. Your brain begins to be impaired at about 5,000 feet above your usual altitude. But that impairment is subtle, and the brain is not designed to pick up impairment. As anybody who's ever watched someone else get drunk knows, the person who is becoming impaired is not aware that they're being impaired. This especially affects men. But they have to make the cockpit room air because electrical insulation will burn in 100% oxygen at very low temperatures. And a cockpit fire is very undesirable, especially with lithium batteries on board. Relatively new information in medicine is about the risk of hypercarbia in flight. It turns out that low pressure stimulates breathing. Our breathing is regulated by the carbon dioxide content in our blood. And so when we go higher, the low pressure stimulates breathing, which causes us to blow off carbon dioxide. That's fine until the carbon dioxide pressure in your blood goes down from the normal 40 to below 30. At that point, the whole sensing apparatus reverses, and you feel more short of breath. So you breathe harder, which drives down the carbon dioxide pressure even more. And that results in tingling and muscle spasm and can be impairing. Once I was manning the emergency room, and they brought in a young girl with the cross-country team who was having full muscle spasms and panting and panic, and it was my daughter. She was a little embarrassed to find the ER doctor was her father, and all he did was put a big paper bag over her head. In any case, they need to scrub carbon dioxide because failing to scrub carbon dioxide leads to this reversal of sensation, and the pilots become very short of breath, and that itself is impairing. I've gone through the risk of pressure and the Armstrong limit. This is very important, but only as a threat, because only if the cockpit fails will they experience this. We've talked about the risk in crashes. I'll skip this one. I've given this talk to soaring pilots who go up without pressurization. They seem not to be aware that once you're above 15,000 feet pressure, your bubbles start forming in people's blood. By the time you get to 30,000 feet, everybody's got bubbles in their blood. And whether you get decompression illness mainly depends on other factors. By breathing 100% oxygen, you can get rid of the nitrogen that forms most of the bubbles. As you can see, the half-life of this is about 90 minutes, so you need to do at least 2 half-lives to get rid of 90% of the nitrogen. This is an old article showing the frequency of getting gas in the blood. This is 15,000 feet. 20% of people have bubbles in their blood at 15,000 feet after 2 hours. And at only 22,000 feet, we have here almost 90% of the people with bubbles in their blood. And this is why fighter cockpits are pressurized to about 25,000 feet. Decompression sickness is different in pilots than in divers. In divers, the pressures are very high. In pilots, the pressures are very low. When I was in medical school, I was surprised to find that studies of intestinal gas were done by analyzing the gases in a person's exhaled breath. That's because our intestinal gases are absorbed into our blood, and then we can breathe them out. So you don't have to put a tube up a person's tailpipe to study their intestinal gas. It turns out that in pilots, then, not all the bubbles are nitrogen. So if you're going to do a high flight, I'd suggest you not eat cabbage before you go. Then there's some after-disaster risks. This glider is equipped with 2 parachutes. One is a tail drogue parachute. If they lose control, they can deploy that. The glider will descend nose down at about 70 knots, indicated airspeed. And if they put full forward stick and full to the side, then it'll spiral right down. At 12,000 feet, a ballistic parachute, rocket operated, can be deployed. And then it descends nose down at 17 miles an hour. Now, if you looked at that cockpit, the front pilot's feet are in the nose. Think of yourself landing on the rocks at 17 miles an hour, okay? Injury will occur. In addition, they have non-tethered helmets, so when they are going 17 knots straight down and hit the rocks, they're going to bounce their necks and may have fractures. This concerns them. Turns out that most of the flying is done over Lago Argentino, a great big lake. It turns out that the glider is foam core carbon fiber. It will float. So the best place for them to crash, interestingly, is into the lake. And Morgan has done the modeling. He said if they crash into the lake at 17 miles an hour, they'll go in about halfway, bounce out, and float. That's perfect. So when we talked to the rescue folks down there, we found out that they can get a speedboat anywhere in the lake in half an hour. And that's fine. The pilots are not likely at that point to be injured. They have warm clothing, electrically heated clothing, they have reserves of electrical power and oxygen, so they should be fine if they land in the lake. If they land on a glacier, not so good. And there was no helicopter rescue until this last year. So it's an ATV and boots if you land on the terrain. There's a long history that I'm not telling you about this project. It's a privately funded project. There's been no government money. Everybody involved is a soaring pilot, including the CEO of Airbus, who discovered this project languishing about a dozen years ago, and Airbus has been funding the bulk of it ever since. The funding, if they get to 90,000 feet this year, as is very likely, we expect that Airbus will no longer fund the project unless we can find some research reason for it. There's plenty of research that could be done, but my guess is it would cost $1 to $2 million a year just to support the team. And we're not sure anybody will do that, especially in today's funding environment. A dream is Perlan 3 with a self-launching jet-powered sailplane that would punch itself up through the troposphere into the stratosphere. The key is if you're going to do research in the stratosphere, it's got to be reliable. The Egret towplane has made this reliable. Last, see it's a minute overtime. This is the tire after the first Perlan flight this year. Why did it go flat? Well, it's because it's a tubeless tire. The wheel is in two sections and it's sealed with silicone rings. What happens to silicone rings at minus 70 Celsius? It gets stiff and it doesn't seal so well. So between flights, a great deal of thought and effort was put into keeping air in. So here's the second one. It's better, isn't it? And then here's the third one, even higher, but not as flat. And here's the last one. Not quite as high, but very good. Now, as a pilot, I have to tell you, the remarkable thing about these pictures is not that the tire's flat, but the fiberglass is unscratched. This guy's good. There he is, Jim Payne. Air Force Academy, aeronautical engineer, Air Force test pilot, director of the Global Hawks program at Lockheed for a dozen years, record-setting soaring pilot, and very quiet and modest.
I'm guessing he's not married because he couldn't be married to do these things.
The truth is that there was a woman in Kentucky who was teaching school years ago and wanted to be a pilot. And on a Kentucky school teacher's salary, she couldn't afford flying lessons. But she studied up a bit and discovered that in the Air Force, the salaries were a lot higher than in Kentucky, so she joined the Air Force to teach math. She was stationed in Iceland. She got her private pilot's license. And one day, into the flying club came a fighter pilot named Jim Payne. And somehow the electron and the proton stuck together, and they've been married ever since. She is the airplane owner in the family. He is the glider owner. They have a house in Rosamond attached to a hangar at an airport. It's the kind of marriage every pilot needs. She has an eidetic memory. After being with the project last year for a month or so and watching her, I said, Jackie, you're just a human checklist. She knows every detail. She's out on the ramp at pre-flighting it, and she knows if they've missed anything, she makes sure they've touched every point. She's amazing. And she's good-natured besides. The slides you saw as I began were the pictures I took. There's a lot to see in El Calafate if you go a quarter of the way around the world to be there, a third of the way. Glaciers, the Chilean Torres de Paine mountain park, and animals and beautiful, beautiful skies. So if you want more detail, here you are. Thanks for having me.